listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. This week, ASIO raised the terror threat level in Australia from possible to probable. Part of the reason was an increase in young men being radicalised.
With diversion and rehabilitation or de-radicalisation, there is always going to be people who slip through those programs. Sometimes, if a kid has decided, then that's what's going to happen. And at 16, 17, it's not as simple as just, taking away their iPad.
So what does it take to turn a boy into a terrorist in 2024? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, let's get into the headlines with Katrina Blowers. It is Wednesday, the 7th of August.
Well, let's begin in Paris, where history has been made overnight, with 14-year-old Arissa True becoming the youngest Aussie Olympic medal winner ever, taking home gold in the skateboarding.
10 seconds left. She's packed so much into the run already. Let's go, one more. No, bring it in. Yes! She's gone fakey. She's gone fakey.
That was the call on 9, and if you're wondering what a fakie is, which I had no idea what it was either, it's a move in skateboarding in which the skateboarder faces the opposite direction to that which they normally would. Arissa herself is too young to drink or vote or even stay in the village in Paris. Here she is speaking to 9 just moments after her win.
I mean, it's really crazy. I'm just so excited. It's like just so many emotions at once.
What a great story out of Paris overnight, Katrina. The Aussies have had another medal win as well, with the men taking bronze in the cycling track sprint. Now, that puts Australia in third place on the medal tally. We've been teetering between third and fourth, but right now we're third. We've got 35 medals all up. That's behind China, who's number 1 on 56, and the USA with 79. They'd say that makes them first, but because of the ranking with gold being the biggest rank, the USA is not first, they are second. Sadly, though, the Boomers Olympic campaign has come to an end. The men's basketballers blew a massive lead to lose to Serbia 95-90. And this is the first time they're out of the Olympics before the semi-finals since 2012, which is really sad. I spoke about it earlier in the week, the River Seine. She's being very problematic, and once again, she has forced the cancellation of a training session because of pollution in the water. The men's race has also had to be put back a day. So the River Seine still giving main character energy.
Well, this is pretty big. It's finally happened. Kamala Harris has officially picked her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. In a post to Instagram, Harris wrote, "We are going to build a great partnership. We are going to win this election." Now, if you haven't heard of Tim Walz before, what you need to know is that he gives either fun uncle or dad vibes, which really depends on who you speak to. He's only 60, but he kind of looks much older in a way, not in a bad way, Sacha, but in a way that, I guess it's sort of like that sort of homely vibe that you can quote unquote trust. He's a former high school teacher from the Midwest. He also coached the school's football team and served in the National Guard. Walz was the faculty advisor for the school's first gay-straight alliance chapter in 1999 too. He's known for having small L liberal leanings, and this was all long before the Democrats nationally stood for gay rights. He served 12 years in Congress for a conservative and mostly rural southern Minnesota district. But as I mentioned, he has a record of progressive policy achievements that could appeal to left-leaning voters as well. So a really nice balance there. He's also racked up a mega social media following in a very short space of time.
Yeah, well, some of those policies he's gotten over the line include providing universal free school meals for students, enshrining abortion rights into state law, banning gay conversion therapy, and providing protections for gender-affirming health. Walz posted on X saying, "I'm all in. Vice President Harris is showing us the politics of what's possible. It reminds me a bit of the first day of school. So let's get this done, folks." End quote. So there's just over 90 days until Americans head to the polls. Harris and Walz will now have to try and flip those red-leaning states away from Donald Trump and JD Vance. But the real battle is going to be in those swing states, Katrina, and they're about to kick off a 5-day, 7-city tour of those states. And those are likely to determine the November November 5 election. So the first rally the pair will hold will be today. It's in Philadelphia. They'll officially raise the curtain on their campaign together. So it's going to be a really jam-packed next few days. Interestingly, I saw that Harris and Waltz, they didn't have much of a previous relationship before this pick. So Harris has been meeting with potential candidates, and apparently she was very impressed by his warm nature, and they had like a genuine chemistry, which, is important in a running mate, I think. It's different in Australia. We don't put much in stock by our deputies except when the Prime Minister goes overseas and they become the Prime Minister. There's no running mate system here in Australia. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic to watch play out.
Yeah, I'm super excited too to see. I reckon they're going to make use of his family a lot. He's got 2 kids, and interestingly, both of the kids were conceived using IVF. So that's another kind of, differentiator there. And also, as I mentioned, the social media thing can't be taken lightly. He's the one who coined the term of Donald Trump being weird, and that's just taken off online. So, yeah, interesting days ahead.
Global markets have shown signs of recovery following Monday's massive stock market sell-off. Shares on Wall Street went up in morning trade. There were also gains in Europe and Asia, while in Australia, the ASX also steadied. Now, this all comes after that global stock plunge we saw on Monday, which was sparked by fears of a recession in the US off the back of a rise in the unemployment numbers. Analysts are being a bit cautious at the moment, though, saying we might not be out of the woods yet. And sticking back home, we had the interest rates decision yesterday afternoon as well. The RBA said it did consider hiking the official cash rate but chose to leave it on hold at 4.35%. And in bad news for anyone with a mortgage and obviously renters who are copping the brunt of landlords passing on these interest rate hikes when being told not to expect a cut until at least 6 months away. And the forecast is that inflation won't return to the target range until the end of next year. So there were some optimistic outlooks from Treasurer Jim Chalmers when he handed down the budget in May. It looks like maybe we need to temper those expectations.
And big changes could be on the way for Google after a US judge ruled it has an unfair monopoly over internet searches. Now, this is being called a landmark decision, and it's part of a massive antitrust lawsuit against the search engine, which has spent tens of billions of dollars to ensure it is the default search provider on smartphones and web browsers. So I guess what does all of this mean? As with anything in the legal system, the ramifications for Google could be months, even years down the track. One thing it could be stopped from doing is making pricey deals with online service providers that enable it to be the default. Or it could be forced to include, I found this one weird, a choice screen saying, hey guys, I know you searched on Google, but here's a range of other search engine providers you may not have considered. I don't know about that. A fine is also a possibility, but that is not the preferred way to penalise companies like Google, because that's just like them reaching down the back of a couch for some spare change. So any monetary penalty would be an absolute drop in the ocean compared to their $305 billion annual revenue.
I've got to admit, I've never tried another search engine. I think I used to use, was it Ask Jerry in like the early 2000s?
What?
Or Jeeves? It was like Ask Jeeves or something like that. Is that the one?
Yes, that was the one.
We would use that at school, and then we learnt pretty quickly that I don't even know. You know what? I don't even know if Ask Jeeves still exists. Maybe it does. Maybe it's time for us to hit up Jeeves again. I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see if they force Google to say, hey, check out Bing or check out one of these other search engines. Why not? But yeah, we're seeing a lot of these cases at the moment as well, with these big monopolies being broken up. So really interesting to see those companies being held to account. Katrina, thanks so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, it is our deep dive looking into the radicalisation of young people in Australia at the moment off the back of ASIO increasing the terror threat level. It's been 10 years since Australia's terrorism threat level was last raised. In 2014, ISIS was behind concerns of potential attacks on our soil with its online radicalisation of teenagers all over the world. The threat then was Islamic extremism. But now in 2024, we're seeing a range of ideologies that are concerning.
Governments around the world are concerned about youth radicalisation, online radicalisation, and the rise of new mixed ideologies.
One of the big concerns is of the 8 incidents ASIO has picked up in the last 4 months, all of them involved young men. The oldest 21, the youngest just 14. To explain why we're seeing this trend and how to address the new threat, I'm joined by Dr. Levi West. He's a research fellow at the Australian National University and an expert in terrorism and counter-terrorism. Levi, welcome to the briefing. How rare is it, if at all, to see young people caught up in violent ideologies that could lead to terrorist acts?
It remains relatively rare. But the comments that were made in the press conference by the Prime Minister and the Director General of ASIO reflect its ongoing increasing presence within the broader mix of those who become involved. What we know is that in part as a function of COVID, but informed heavily by the changing dynamics of the online environment and the accessibility of extremist content, young people are becoming more involved in terrorism, or at least more vulnerable to exposure and, by extension, involvement.
10 years ago, we were seeing young men being radicalised online by ISIS. Is it the same picture now?
It's a little different, but we are seeing similar manifestations of radicalisation. And I guess what I mean by that is that whilst the specific vectors by which extremist content is reaching young people has changed, so Twitter is not the primary vehicle through which that's happening anymore, what we're seeing is that the process by which young people are becoming exposed to extremist content and then the vulnerabilities that are being targeted by extremist content are much the same regardless of the specific organisational or ideological motivation of the enterprise that's producing the content. You know, teenagers, through normal teenage processes, present a number of vulnerabilities that are particularly exploitable to an extremist organisation. You know, an entirely healthy and well-adjusted teenager is navigating a sense of belonging and meaning in the world, and if they are unable to find that sense of belonging and meaning in what we would refer to as pro-social contexts, so sporting clubs, literally playing footy, church, whatever it might be, conventional, acceptable, pro-social contexts, they still need to feel that sense of belonging and meaning, and they will find it somewhere. And that can be, if they find themselves down a rabbit hole in the online environment, an extremist organisation or a sense of identity and belonging with an extremist movement or a group.
So I referenced 10 years ago and ISIS, that was the main sort of culprit for online radicalisation. What about now? Are we still seeing that it's groups, that it's organised extremist groups, or is this more ideas that are being spread and communicated and the ideology is based on those ideas as opposed to a group?
Yeah, so it depends in part on which part of the terrorist ecosystem we want to discuss. So if we're talking about what would broadly be referred to as Salafi jihadist terrorism, so that's the ideological motivation that sits behind an Al-Qaeda or Islamic State and all of the lone actors who committed acts on their behalf, then we see that the propaganda that's produced by that movement is still relatively organisationally centric, right? So it's still Islamic State propaganda or Al-Qaeda propaganda. It might be produced by an affiliate or a geographical division of that organisation, but it is still broadly branded as Islamic State or Al-Qaeda content. When we shift to what the scholarly community would just refer to as the extreme right, but in Australia, government refers to as ideologically motivated violent extremism. We're talking about a really different organisational structure within that movement, which is that there really isn't a centralised organisation like an Islamic State. And so you see a much less coherent, much less centralised, often more bottom-up and DIY form of propaganda, where ideas that are still relatively coherent and relatively centralised in their conceptualisation can manifest in really quite obscure ways that often become indecipherable to those who don't have specialist knowledge and understanding. And probably the simplest and possibly most accessible example of that is something like Pepe the Frog. right? So Pepe the Frog is a innocuous, almost obscure, or was obscure, cartoon frog that was co-opted by the alt-right in the United States in the lead up to former President Trump's first election to have a whole bundle of meaning attached to it when it was deployed in a particular way. And that if you didn't know anything about the alt-right, then Pepe the Frog was a cartoon frog of no relevance at all. But if you were someone who was spending a grossly disproportionate amount of your time on what at that stage was probably 4chan or 8chan or other image boards, then you knew that Pepe the Frog had a whole bundle of racist undertones and white supremacist undertones and other connotations attached to it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm interested to know as well about how the social media landscape has changed in the last 10 years. What are the sites that we're seeing now that young people are using and are being radicalised through?
When Islamic State was at its peak, Twitter was its primary sort of vehicle for distributing, at least publicly, extremist content and propaganda. And both through government actions, but governments liaising with, admittedly, I'd acknowledge here that this is Twitter under its previous ownership and leadership, Twitter and other social media companies made reasonably concerted efforts to try and address the presence of extremist content on their platforms. And there's Facebook and Twitter primarily, and YouTube. But in the way that terrorist organisations do, they evolve in response to countermeasures. That's how they survive. And terrorist content, broadly speaking, in the online environment has shifted to sort of alternative tech platforms. So platforms like Gab and Telegram and increasingly Discord and other gaming platforms. And then we get into a universe of platforms that most people over the age of 20 probably haven't heard of. Again, that is shaped in part by which ideological manifestation you're looking at. The extreme right tends to be a little bit more diverse in the platforms that it uses. The jihadist universe primarily clusters around Telegram. Both of them use Telegram quite extensively. The gaming platforms are an increasingly significant component of how terrorist organisations distribute their content and how they access audiences or potential audiences and potential recruits, in part because any organisation that's looking to recruit people for the purposes of violence tends to target, broadly speaking, 16 to 25-year-old men.
So I guess then the next question is, we saw a lot of work go into de-radicalising teenagers in the wake of the rise of ISIS. What are we seeing happen now in that space? Is it the same programs, but they're expanding a bit to include far-right ideologies like white supremacy and incels? Or is it different? Does the approach have to be different as the threat changes?
De-radicalisation is a kind of terrible term for what is really diversion and rehabilitation. Right? So if we take away all of the special things that go with as soon as the word terrorism is mentioned and think of this as sort of conventional, how do we respond to a young person who's heading down a path that isn't going to work out well for them, and that's a diversion program. The processes that we use for dealing with extremism and terrorist offenders are roughly the same as they would be for any other type of offence. The challenge comes more so than it does in regards to specific ideological content, because what we do know pretty well is that the last thing you want to do with someone who holds extreme beliefs is sit them down and tell them they're wrong and expect them to simply be, sorry, I didn't realise, and abandon their views, their worldview, probably reasonably well held, that one that they're prepared to sacrifice things for. So what those programs tend to look more like is what any diversion program looks like, right? Is like, what's going on with this kid's life, what's going on at home, what's going on at school, what's happening in terms of their job prospects, are they meaningfully engaged with the community that they live in, and so on and so forth, and what can we do to try and address those things? And that often looks like setting up a whole bundle of wraparound services and support services to address the underlying drivers that are resulting in them then going to find solace and return on investment with an extremist ideology or organisation, movement, whatever the case may be. So, rehabilitation and diversion are really, really important. The hard part about them is that they are labour intensive and they suffer from zero tolerance for failure in the perspective of the broader public. So one 16-year-old kid who happens to have been on a diversion program commits an attack or something that's alleged to be a terrorist attack. And any discussion of the merits or otherwise of diversion and rehabilitation suddenly becomes a horrible political football that gets tossed around. Everyone claims that, well, obviously they don't work because we expect 100% success from those programs, which is we don't expect that from really any other type of diversion or rehabilitation program. We release some of the worst prisoners, child sex offenders get released from prison after doing rehabilitation programs, and we tolerate the fact that sometimes, as horrific as it is, they are going to reoffend. We don't toss those programs out. We don't declare them to be failures. With terrorism and extremism, we hold it to a standard that's more akin to the standard we quite rightly hold to counter-terrorism itself, where if an attack takes place, that is something that shouldn't happen. With diversion and rehabilitation or de-radicalisation, there is always going to be people who slip through those programs, who are determined, right? And I think anyone who's got kids knows how sometimes if a kid has decided, then that's what's going to happen, right? And at 16, 17, it's not as simple as just, taking away their iPad. And it's really also really hard to measure how many people didn't become something. You're trying to measure negatives, and that's a problem that space has, broadly speaking. So, yeah.
Well, Dr. Levi West, it sounds like it is extremely complicated, to say the least. But, the fact that ASIO's taken this step is a sign that they're on it and they're watching it. So, as they advised, be aware but not afraid. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. No worries.
That was Dr. Levi West from ANU there. And that is all for this episode of The Briefing. Thanks so much for listening. Before you go, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we are on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 3. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.